Well, as Martin was saying before, we don't organise themes, but I feel that God's gone ahead of me and really paved the way just with a few of the thoughts that Margaret Court was sharing. The fact that truth is always truth and that a lie doesn't become truth for having been repeated very frequently. So one of the issues that I want to talk about today, I have half an hour to share with you a nugget, and of course we deal with some fairly controversial issues at ACL, so I'm going to tackle the most controversial, which is the narrative of the sexual rights activists that has informed the marriage debate last year, but that's not the end. They've got more in their sights. And one of the things that I want to do is to equip the church to argue a counter-narrative and to realise that the things that there are flaws in their arguments. They will claim science as the basis for things that are not scientifically supportable. And so one of the things I want to do is where the flaws in their argument are. I've likened it to, have I got the clicker? Does the clicker work? I've likened it to a sheep track. So the sheep track of public opinion, and I'm aware that one of the marvels of the modern debates is that the whole transgender movement has swept in as quickly as it has, and people are a bit astonished, why is it that this has gained ground so quickly? And one of the reasons, of course, is that it's working on the same logic that was established in the homosexual rights movement over the last 4 decades, really since Kinsey. And because we believe certain things to be true, then we accept that same logic for the transgender rights movement. So those of you who are familiar with the habits of sheep, you'll see that there's this great big wide open space. The sheep could go in any direction, but they don't. They're stuck in a rut. They follow the bottom of the sheep in front, and they don't really question the direction or whether or not that's the right direction to go in. And I really feel that the public opinion, including Christians, are being misled on the basis of believing certain things that just actually aren't true. So, in the next half hour, I'm going to try and unpack some of this, and because I'm leading you into a forest of unfamiliar ideas, I've drawn a mud map. That might look intimidating for now, but we'll work our way through it. It's really just to give you a visual for some of the ideas that I'm going to be addressing. So, first of all, just to talk about the narrative of the activists, the line that we're being sold, we're told that LGBT people are an identifiable minority group, that it's a stable, fixed property of identity. We're told that this group is suffering, and that this suffering is the result of social stigma. And therefore, the answer to this suffering is greater social inclusion, and that in order to make these people suffer less, we need to show compassion by altering society in a way that makes them feel more comfortable. So obviously that's an argument that would appeal to anyone with an ounce of compassion. That's the carrot. And then the ferocious rage of the activists at anyone who questions the narrative, well, that's the stick. And between the stick and the carrot, we're being herded along this little sheep track. So today I'm going to break out of the rut and show you another way of looking at it. Really, I think we need to out-compassion the left, because Christians care about LGBT suffering. And I want to show you through this process that if we follow the logic of the activists, it's very apparent that they don't. It's quite a heartless movement, and the very people that they purport to help are the people who are suffering most. So just to look at, there's a lot of things that we disagree with, and there's a minefield of false research out there. But one of the things that I think we can all agree on is that LGBT people are suffering. And don't trust any research that you have out of La Trobe about this, but I did find this particular study from America. It's produced by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. So it's a regular health survey that they run every few years, and they ask teenagers between the ages of 14 and 17 all sorts of health-related questions. Do you sleep? Do you wear a seatbelt? Do you eat your broccoli? Do you do your homework? Do you smoke? How much? All sorts of questions like that. And in the last round of this, they decided to ask them whether they identified as LGB, so lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or not sure, or heterosexual. So for the first time, we can map a sexual orientation onto these other health-related behaviours. And the survey it's nationally representative, and it covers 15,500 students. So these are some of the results that we have. I've just put some of them into a table so that we can look at them quickly. This is just to give you a snapshot of LGBT suffering. So we have heterosexuals, LGB, and not sure. So I'm going to call these the sexual minority students in the last 2 columns. And you can see from this that sexual minority students are twice as likely to have been threatened with a weapon at school, twice as likely to have been in a fight, and specifically at a fight in school, twice as likely to have been electronically bullied, and twice as likely to have been bullied in school. This relates to sexual and dating violence, and we can see that again, sexual minority students are twice as likely to have had sex before the age of 13, 2 to 3 times as likely to have had forced sexual intercourse, so rape, more than twice as likely to have been forced to perform an unwanted sexual act by a partner in the previous 12 months. So that refers to somebody that they're actually in a relationship with. 2 to 3 times as likely to have been deliberately hurt by a partner in the last 12 months. So remember, some of these kids are 14 years old who are answering these surveys. Sexual minority students are 2 to 3 times more likely to have felt sad or hopeless in the last 12 months. 3 to 4 times more likely to have contemplated suicide, about 3 times as likely to have made a suicide plan, 2 to 5 times more likely to have acted on that plan, and up to 5 times as likely to have needed medical treatment as a result of acting on that plan. So I think here we have a snapshot of kids who are suffering. But what this study doesn't show us is causation. Actually, the people who wrote this study in the end say, so what we need is an anti-bullying program. And I think that this is letting kids down really badly. If I were a school counsellor and a kid came into my office and told me that this was their history, I would not necessarily assume that social stigma was their biggest problem in life. And I think anyone that would say that is actually heartless and ignoring the real problem that is going on here, because these statistics don't show us causation. Do we believe that LGBT kids are more likely to be raped before the age of 13? Or that kids who are raped before the age of 13 are more likely to identify as LGB as a result? Are LGB youth bullied at school because all the other kids are homophobic? It's a possibility. It's probably a contributing factor. But what another possibility is that LGBT kids are vulnerable for a whole host of reasons, and that makes them stand out as the obvious target for the school bully. Are LGBT youth suicidal because of social exclusion, or because they've been raped and bullied at school? So I think in order to really address the problems of these kids, it's really important that we understand what the problem is, and the only problem is not social exclusion. So there are 2 ways of thinking about LGBT suffering. You can think theory 1, that stigma is the only problem. And this is where the activists are coming from. We're told that LGBT kids are born that way, that there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's like having red hair or being left-handed. And therefore, if you think that red-haired people are committing suicide in larger numbers, well, clearly we're not treating red-haired people very well, and they would apply that same logic then to LGBT children. So an alternative explanation is that an LGBT identity is somehow symptomatic of a disruption to psychosexual development. And that doesn't mean that they're unhappy because of social stigma. Social stigma can still be a factor, but it's only one of a number of factors. Whereas if we go with theory 1, then stigma is the only factor, and that is the sheep track that the activists are funneling us down. So we're being advised to proceed solely on the basis of theory 1, and then the Christians who don't accept the truth that someone is LGB, we're easily painted as unloving of that person. And in fact, we become part of the problem. We're dangerous because we're creating the social stigma that says there's something wrong with them. And if everyone just stopped saying it, then suddenly they wouldn't be so unhappy. The problem with this, and the reason why it's so clever and has been so successful, is that when you believe that people are born that way, then their sexual orientation and gender identity becomes a part of their inherent identity. You can't separate the behaviour from the person anymore. And so this is why Christians are being told that we're haters, that we actually can't love that person if we think that that's not God's ideal plan for them, which is a problem. So I'm going to examine the born that way narrative because we're often told that it has scientific credentials. I've heard the former Chief Justice Michael Kirby in several interviews over the last 20 years explain that, and sometimes with exasperation, we've had the science on this for 70 years. And what he's talking about is the research of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, which was published in 1948 and 1953. He published reports on the sexual behaviour of the human male and the sexual behaviour of the human female. And what he proposed was that this would shine the white light of unbiased science on our knowledge of human sexuality. And this is what Kirby is still claiming as science. And what he says, we know on the basis of Kinsey's work, is this. Mostly people are heterosexual, but there is a sizable and continuous and stable group of people who are not, and this is just part of the actuality of nature, and if it's part of nature, it's what's intended to be. Now, you even hear this from Christian ministers who will say, well, if God created homosexuals, he must love homosexuals just the way they are. And that is then inconsistent with the teaching that God does not approve of homosexuality, and the answer, of course, the Christian answer is to say that homosexuality is not a fixed property of identity. It's not something that is created in people by God. But, of course, this is what Kinsey says. Kirby says Kinsey's research shows us that this is part of nature and that it's a stable, fixed property. So there's a problem because Kirby's a very well-respected member of the community, and I haven't heard anyone contradict what he says. A lot of people will be influenced to believe that this is true, and there are two problems with it. First of all, no one can honestly claim that Kinsey is science. He's been thoroughly debunked. I don't have time to go into it all today, but it's agenda-led research, a really early example of it, and very thoroughly well done from that point of view, but leading us off in the wrong direction. And the second problem with what Kirby says is that this isn't what Kinsey said anyway. Kinsey did not believe that homosexuality was a fixed property of identity. He actually believed that all sorts of sexual behaviour was available for everybody, that we're all potentially homosexual or bisexual. In fact, he thought that in an ideal world, most of us would be bisexual because he was bisexual. So, and Kinsey's ideas are still very radical. So basically, he produced cooked figures to show if you interview the occupants of homosexual nightclubs, you'll discover that a surprising number of people are homosexual, and that's pretty much what he did. And then he said, well, because it's so common, it must be natural, and because it's natural, it must be normal, and therefore we need to reduce all of the moral restrictions around all sorts of sexual practices. So in order to advocate for his point of view, this is the ultimate in social constructionist arguments. There's nothing actually wrong with any sexual practices at all. It's only how we think about those sexual practices that makes them problematic. So in order to sustain that point of view logically, you can't believe that sex is ever damaging. And surprisingly, I mean, people would be surprised to realise that Kinsey was advocating for everything. Bestiality, incest, extramarital sex, S&M, homosexuality and pedophilia. Because if you're sweeping away the whole moral apparatus that judges some types of sexual behaviour to be good and others to be bad, you can't afford to leave any vestiges. So everything has to be okay as far as Kinsey is concerned. Now, not many people would agree, 70 years on, that this is a really good social policy. Most of us object to pedophilia, for example. That represents one of the areas in which we've been successful in pushing back, by the way, because up until 20 years ago, the Kinseyan push to reduce the restrictions around pedophilia, in fact, some of the low sentences that you'll notice people are getting now, that's a result of Kinseyan policy being put in place. So now we've recognised that Kinsey's wrong, at least in that one aspect, so there is hope. But just to show you, so most people would not agree that it's safe to deregulate sex. But just to show you, to give you a sort of example of where Kinsey's coming from, this is what he says about pedophilia. If a child were not culturally conditioned, it is doubtful if it would be disturbed by sexual approaches. Some of the more experienced students of juvenile problems, these are pedophiles that he was taking his advice from, have come to believe that the emotional reactions of parents, police officers and other adults who discover that the child has had such contact may disturb the child more than the sexual contacts themselves. So you see here already that Kinsey has not only created the permission structure for all sorts of sexual activity, he's created the weaponry to turn against the people who oppose that and who think that that's a bad idea. So he would argue that stigma is the problem. And this logic has worked to undermine traditional moral constraints around human sexuality because, as the activists would argue, why should your pious moral judgments constrain my behaviour? And how do you know that homosexuality isn't conducive to happy life outcomes? And just because S&M isn't your cup of tea, well, how can you judge consenting adults who like to indulge? And these are the arguments that have been eroding our moral boundaries over the last 7 decades. And then why should there be a charmed inner circle of heterosexual monogamous sexuality and everyone else is left out in the outer darkness? And then when we see that this isn't a recipe for human flourishing and people are genuinely suffering because of this, well, then we can pivot to the stigma argument and say that it's society's repressive values, it's those nasty Christians. And just to give you another example, this is already being used for prostitution, around prostitution. So Peter was explaining that a lot of prostitutes suffer from PTSD. Well, in the ACT, they would say, well, that's because of social stigma. What we need is more inclusion, more visibility of prostitutes, and then that wouldn't be such a problem. So you can use this argument for sexual rights of any variety. And the pedophiles are using this, by the way. It's not a new thing. But in terms of political rights activism, the idea that all sexuality is okay is only going to get you so far. You don't really create a victim status on the basis of everything's okay. So Kinsey's not going to get you where you want if you're a homosexual rights activist. You need a secondary argument, and that is the born that way idea. And this was borrowed then from the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The civil rights movement quite rightly argued that it was wrong to discriminate against people on the basis of their race. They're born that way, they can't change it. And the homosexual rights activists who were waiting in the wings just saw that that worked quite well and said, great, let's use that logic as well, please. So the born that way narrative is absolutely essential to the ongoing progress of the sexual revolution, and it's really important that we understand that this is an idea that we need to sort of take hold of by the scruff of the neck and shake it out until its pockets fall out and we can see what's lurking beneath, because this is not an accurate idea. It's not grounded in science. But it does create various benefits for the sexual rights movement. First of all, it means that sexual minorities are bona fide minorities. They're fixed, they're not going to grow. You're not going to convert the heterosexual kids, are you? And you'll hear people sneering at us in the media going, oh, you can't catch it. So that means that inclusion is safe. And so we can have gay and lesbian teachers talk to their students about their lifestyles. We can have comprehensive sexuality education in schools because we're not going to convert the heterosexual kids. And on the other hand, we know that there are some LGBT kids who are just LGBT from birth and they need to learn about their sexual practices too, don't they? So there's a lot of public policy that changes if you believe born that way. So from the 1970s, the sexual rights movement have been using both of these arguments. And particularly aggressive political protest has been the way that they've changed it. They'd like us to believe that they've changed it on the basis of science, but in fact that's not the case. The American Psychological Association in the 1973 took homosexuality out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness as a result of aggressive social protest, not as a result of any science or open research that had been done. And Nicholas Cummings, who is the president of the American Psychological Association in 1979, describes how over the period of the 70s and 80s, the American Psychological Association was overtaken by the left. So he says, we developed a group of psychologists that numbered about 200 to 250, and they rotated themselves through all the offices of the APA. And when a rule was passed that you couldn't serve more than X number of sessions on council or in a certain particular office, then they would rotate. And they would run for another office and then come back to council. And so for years, about 200 to 250 people were running the APA, and they were a very strict inbred group. They were ultra-liberal, and anything that wasn't ultra-liberal was anathema. So here we have the slow march through the institutions. It's not just the universities, it's the professional associations as well. The American Psychological Association used to have a principle that governed its proceedings called the Leona Tyler Principle. It was named for a previous president of the American Psychological Association, and the Leona Tyler Principle said that the American Psychological Association would never support science conclusions that weren't based on scientific evidence. But from the mid-1990s, the Leona Tyler Principle was absolutely forgotten. You won't find it in any of their literature now, and political stances seem to override any scientific results. And so we're seeing this now with transgenderism as well. This is being pushed through the American Medical Association and the Psychological Association and the American Pediatrics Association by special interest groups. So they claim to have scientific credentials, but they don't. It's politically based. So once the APA had agreed that homosexuality was not a sign of pathology, and Nicholas Cummings will say the unbiased open research on homosexuality was never done, because once they had the results, they just ran with that, and they unveiled a marketing strategy. This is the work of Marshall Kirk and Erastes Pill, who were two gay Harvard-trained sociologists, and in 1987 they produced this document called Overhauling Straight America, and this is what they recommended the gay rights movement do. Talk about gays and gayness as loudly and as often as possible until people are bored by it. Portray gays as victims, not as aggressive challengers. Give protesters a just cause, so create allies. Give gays make them look good, make victimisers look bad, solicit funds and get on the air, access to TV, radio. And you can only admire the efficiency with which they've stuck to this script, so that now every sitcom has to have a gay character, a sympathetic gay character, and it's funneled all through our media, promoted, and in fact White Magazine, who won't promote it, get shut down, because we're not just required to tolerate it, we're required to affirm it and celebrate it as a good thing. So that's to show you that there's no reason to believe that Born That Way is based on science, but more importantly, there's a lot of evidence to contradict that claim. So there's a few studies that I'll mention here. This one from Denmark in 2006 was a study of 2 million people, and it showed that not only the loss of a parent, but specifically the loss of the same-sex parent in childhood was linked to an increased likelihood of entering into a same-sex marriage in adulthood. So these researchers concluded, our study provides population-based prospective evidence that childhood family experiences are important determinants of heterosexual and homosexual marriage decisions in adulthood. There's a US national longitudinal study of adolescent and adult health, AdHealth, and this has been following a nationally representative cohort of students from the 1990s. The latest one was 2008, when the sample is now aged between 24 and 32. And what this shows is that 80% of boys who identify as same-sex attracted in their teenage years will identify as heterosexual if you only leave them alone until the age of 25. And the same with girls. 60% who identified as having some same-sex attraction in adolescent years identify as exclusively heterosexual at wave 4, and 30% identify as mostly heterosexual. So in the vast majority of cases, teenagers that express some sort of confusion about their sexual orientation will work it out if you just leave them alone. And the activists know that. That's why they want to get in there, to cement them in a queer identity in their formative years. There's a new handbook that's been produced, the Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology. It's produced by the American Psychological Association in 2014, and it confirms that there is excellent research for associative or potentially causal links between child sexual abuse and ever having had same-sex partners, especially for men. And Kinsey's pedophiles would say that as well. They're saying we're getting in there to teach boys about how to be homosexual, because if you leave them alone, they turn out to be heterosexual. So we've got to get them when they're children. This is what's going on. Dr. Lisa Diamond, who's the co-editor-in-chief of the new Handbook for Sexuality and Psychology, and she's a lesbian activist, but she acknowledges that there is now excellent and abundant research to show that sexual orientation, including attraction, behaviour and identity self-label, all three are fluid for both adolescents and for adults and for both genders. So when she released this information, it caused alarm in the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, who warned that the ex-gay therapy would be undermining the battle for LGBT rights, and she responded in this way. I feel as a community, the queers have to stop saying, please help us, we're born this way and we can't change, as an argument for legal standing. That argument is going to bite us in the arse, because now we know that there's enough data out there and the other side is aware of it as much as we're aware of it. So most people who voted yes in the recent plebiscite think that inclusion looks like this, which is going to be nice to everybody. There's this stable minority of homosexual people, and everything else will stay the same. We're just going to make a few minor adjustments for our LGBT friends, and it won't make much of a difference to everybody else. But if you read their activist policy recommendations or demands, in fact, you realise that inclusion looks like this. So if we're going to include LGBT people, we need a lot more anti-discrimination laws. We need to redefine marriage and the family. We need comprehensive sexuality education for everybody. We need conversion therapy to be banned. In order to accommodate the transgenders, we need to redefine man and woman. And then we have compelled speech and laws against misgendering. And non-believers, including parents, need to be considered abusive and need to be punished. And then to accommodate the polyamorous, we need to denigrate monogamy and redefine marriage. And then to accommodate the pedophiles, let's get rid of the age of consent laws, please. So diversity of opinion is welcome in the outer darkness. So can we spot the instruments of totalitarianism yet? This is going to change society for everybody. I haven't got time to elaborate on those last two, but it's interesting to note that that does appear in the gay and lesbian manifestos from the 1970s onwards. So we can definitely expect that those things will be coming through on the sheep track and the logic that has been worn by the homosexual rights movement. And if you listen to the LGBT activists, it's very clear that the small I inclusion that I was talking about here, that's not what they're after at all, because they believe that LGBT stigma comes from being different. It comes from heteronormativity. In a world that is based on assumptions that heterosexuality is normal and gender congruence is normal, LGBT people are made to feel different. So as long as we have heteronormativity, we're going to have LGBT suffering. The answer for them is to get rid of heteronormativity and develop a world where, in fact, everybody belongs in the alphabet soup somewhere. So they haven't even developed a word for this. So I've given it a name and I've called it queer normativity. We don't often win the language battle, you know, so I've made up a word. I'm not proud of it. It's not a beautiful word, but it does. It's a fitting word, I think, for what they're trying to establish. So I want to just draw this to a close by saying that there are some very important reasons to push back, particularly on the Born That Way narrative. And there are two, really. I've been reading Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, and I don't like the sound of the gulags. And I can see in this the instruments of totalitarianism being rolled out and fundamental changes to society. So the church really needs to stand up while we're still able to do so. The second reason, which is much more compelling in a way, is that LGBT people undoubtedly suffer the most for being fed the message that the world hates them, and particularly Christians. We're homophobic, we're transphobic. And we need the opportunity to show them that that's a lie, and that compassion and love for LGBT people, particularly LGBT kids, means that we need to brave the ferocious rage of the left and to tell the truth and to expose the lies behind these ideas which are allowing this totalitarian, heartless regime to be rolled through. So these people, the activists, don't care about LGBT welfare. They're using LGBT people as a sort of human shield. They stick them on the pointy end of their political agenda as they ram it through. And I don't know, we need to develop a counter-narrative to demolish their arguments and to re-establish a society based on healthiness and truth, which doesn't change. It always was there, it always was the same. The recipe for human happiness has not changed just because of Kinsey's lies and the Born That Way activist narrative. So thank you very much. I hope that makes sense.